Hello, everyone here and around the world on the internet. I'm Greg Chalmers, the technical program in the Salem Center here at the University of Texas. Today we're starting to introduce our speaker. I want to say first you'll find on the sides of each row coming in three things. You'll find handouts for today's talk, and if we'll kind of pass them down the rows, if people nearest the end wouldn't mind grabbing them and passing them, that would be a big help. There's also a bookmark announcing and advertising an essay contest, and there's a sheet of paper describing and advertising a couple of other events taking place on campus this week for Free Speech Week that people here might be interested in. For people watching us online, you can't go to the end of the row to get a handout, but if you click in the YouTube description, you should find a link to a place on the web where you can see the PDF, and so you'll be able to follow along with that. Pleased to be able to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tara Smith, Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Texas, author of many great articles and a number of books, most recently Ayn Rand's Normative Ethics, The Virtuous Egoist, and Judicial Review in an Objective Legal System. Today she's here for Free Speech Week to talk to us about freedom of the press in an age of misinformation, cognitive problems, and legal solutions. Tara, thank you for joining us.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks very much to Greg and the Salem Center for having me. And thank you all for turning out. It's nice to see several faces I know in a different, not in the classroom, and some other faces I know, and a lot of faces I don't know. So thanks a lot for turning out. And I do want to just amplify a little bit on a couple of the announcements about things that are around. So two things of interest. The one, particularly to students, is the essay contest. So if you haven't already, on your way out, try to get a bookmark. Essay contest for UT undergrads only. The deadline is in a few weeks, November 4th. There's a choice of two topics, one of which concerns freedom of the press that you can choose from. Prizes go from $700 to $1,000 to $1,500. 3 prizes. Freshmen have won this in the past. Really encourage you to check out the essay contest. And the other thing is, it is Free Speech Week. There are a variety of events going on. It's been a little hard to find out what they are, but I know of at least a couple of others, and there's information about another talk on Thursday and another panel at the law school on Friday, so if you're interested in that, look for one of those sheets of paper before you leave. Okay, but now let's get down to business. And I do hope everybody has a handout for tonight's lecture, because that'll just help a little bit at certain times. We live, it seems, in an era of misinformation. So-called fake news, alternative facts, your truth versus mine, and deliberate disinformation have warped our discussions of urgent issues. People seem to fall for stupid ideas and take harmful actions as a result. Conspiracy theories were on conspicuous display during the COVID pandemic, during the 2020 presidential election. Journalists at respected publications have sometimes misled us as well, not intentionally, but have misled us. Think about coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop, for instance, or different techniques for dealing with COVID. In reaction, one could go on at great length just about some of the tides of seeming misinformation, but in reaction, the conclusion that's increasingly drawn, and really from people across the ideological spectrum, is that we need the government to exert more control over our conversations. Not only should social media companies adopt stricter content policies, but the government should regulate our exchanges. And what lends particular credibility to this call is the claim that the digital is different. And I'm kind of going to use that as a tagline tonight. So this idea that the digital era is different. Today's technologies alter our communications so dramatically that our legal system should adjust its policies accordingly. Numerous authors have been warning that digital technologies overpower reason and threaten democracy. The internet is an engine of industrialized persuasion, quoting one philosopher, which can't be countered by traditional methods. Just yesterday in the New York Times, I read another opinion piece saying the same thing. quoting, this was Tufekci yesterday, quote, laws written for a different era cannot resolve the problems of our current media ecology, close quote. Even some of the staunchest defenders of free speech in general, freedom for even the most offensive speech, people like Jonathan Rauch, a name that might be familiar to some of you, agree that no, we can no longer deal with the swamp of bad information, of stupid ideas with traditional methods. So the question we're going to be focusing on really is digital different? Is it different in respects that alter what our laws should be, right? That's, is it different in the critical respects? To be effective, a legal system has to keep up with the times. And just as we often say that a military shouldn't fight today's wars with the methods that might have been suitable to the past war, the last war, we shouldn't try to fight speech or encourage better speech through tools that might have been adequate in their time in the past. Okay, I mean, that's the basic issue. Now, I will argue that while our information environment is in poor condition and people's acceptance of falsehoods can be severely, can lead them to do really destructive things, the restriction of speech by government is not the solution. I think it's wrong in principle, and I think it's counterproductive in practice. It would only make the problem worse by failing to address the root of the problem, which I think is epistemological rather than legal. Our basic problem is not too open an internet or too free a discussion, but the decline of people's cognitive capacities. It's poor thinking in scrutinizing the vast material that is now at our disposal. And we can't solve cognitive problems through coercive solutions. There's a mismatch there. That remedy doesn't fit what the problem actually is, okay? So you're with me so far? That's the basic setup. Now you've got what we're going to be talking about, I hope, okay? So an outline on the handout. What you're getting tonight is an outtake from a paper that I'm writing. So it's a paper in progress. You're getting part of it, not all of it. I'm omitting large portions. But basically, the lecture is in 3 parts. So first, and this is part 2, I'll lay out the basic argument for the view that the digital is different. Okay. Next, I'll explain why I think the argument fails. Now, I'm only going to give you half of my explanation tonight, but I'll focus on one part of the response to that difference argument. What I'll be arguing is that the idea that greater restrictions will help us better find the truth and have more truth-tracking conversations, that rests on an untenable image of how we acquire knowledge. So I'm going to ask us to be a little bit epistemological tonight. That is, to think about how we acquire knowledge. And I'm saying the digital different argument really rests on a false model there, an erroneous picture. And then finally, much more briefly, I'll draw some parallels between press freedom and religious freedom to reinforce what I think is the proper position on government regulation. Okay. And 2 prefatory notes before we jump in. Nothing that I say is meant to defend speech that violates others' rights, such as occurs in cases of libel or fraudulent misrepresentation of what I'm trying to sell him and get his money from him for, or reckless endangerment, or a few other kinds of circumstances. There are certain circumstances, limited but real, in which I think one person's speech can violate somebody else's. That's not the kind of thing that I'm defending, okay? The other thing is, I've cast this as about freedom of the press. Almost everything I say would apply equally to freedom of speech more generally. There are some reasons why I wanted to pitch it as press, but I don't want to take the time to go into that now. We could if you want to talk about it later. Okay? But I realize, and we should all be aware that, yeah, I'm even going to be using the two somewhat interchangeably, freedom of press, freedom of speech. Okay? Okay. So, the digital is different. Let's just basically get that set up again, the argument. In the pungent phrasing of a UCLA law professor, Eugene Volokh, we live in an era of cheap speech. Meaning, barriers to entry into conversation of global reach, financial barriers to entry, technical, professional, have been lowered dramatically, making it far less costly to circulate one's own thoughts and to consume those of others. The volume of material that's available has grown astronomically, while the speed of its circulation has also accelerated. All of this aids good ideas as well as bad. It helps dissidents to mobilize, it helps autocrats to oppress, and it helps views outside the mainstream to reach an audience. Some of those are crackpot views, and some of those are really constructive views. So all sorts seem to benefit from this cheapening of speech. In the past, the profession of journalism served as something of a gatekeeper, a largely responsible filter for the information that most people would encounter. Now, immediately you have to say, look, the press never screened things perfectly by any stretch, and there were always sensationalists and tabloids and so on. That's not a new phenomenon. But by and large, there were professional standards that exerted more sway and often had a real beneficial influence. The digital age, by contrast, it seems anyone can publish anything, and they do. Digital communications reward impulsivity, neuroscientists warn us, thereby encouraging the more spontaneous posting over the more considered. Platforms often allow authors anonymity, which, by weakening accountability, further encourages careless claims. And amidst shifting market incentives, many journalists themselves increasingly seem to prize speed over accuracy, or clickability of their pieces over the sobriety of judgment in those pieces. Consumer habits, we're not done yet, right? We're going to get some of the blame here as well, okay? Consumer habits are yet a further factor in the deteriorating information environment, as the public is less inclined to turn to trained specialists in the news to obtain their news. Increasingly, people acquire the news from a melange of sources, social media, colleagues, friends, who they happen to run into and what that person happened to raise in their casual conversation on the way to work, right? Many enjoy the convenience of one-stop shopping at platforms that offer news feeds alongside their friends' wedding videos and martini recipes and, extended arguments about whether the coach should be sacked, okay? Actually, according to a recent study, a quarter of American TikTok users regard it as a news source. Just saying, just reporting what I reported, okay? In short, the argument runs. Standards are slipping. The news has become less reliable as it races breathlessly to keep up and attract eyeballs, rather than to convey what's true and what's important. The lesson drawn is we need laws to rein in the media. Sadly, the greater availability of material has not brought with it greater understanding. If anything, most people feel overwhelmed, as if they're drowning in ceaseless floods of information and misinformation. The volume of material available, the velocity of its circulation, and its highly variable quality have effectively brought us to the Wild West, and we need the sheriff to step in and impose boundaries on what we may and may not say. Now, advocates of restrictions, government restrictions, are not necessarily indifferent to the value of free speech. Some of them tailor their remedies to preserve as much freedom as possible. So, for example, you'll hear, one proposal is that private companies should be free to have whatever content policies they want, but they should be required to disclose the mechanics by which they operate. That is, what's the algorithm such that this woman, when she clicks on the same thing, will see this set of options and he'll see this other thing, right? I mean, we all know about that, how things are very customized to the particular user. Well, what's your formula, Google or Facebook or whoever it might be? What's your algorithm? What are the mechanics by which you do this? That's all we need to know. Others will say what we need to regulate is not speech itself, and this is a very closely related proposal, but the design of those technologies. It's not just that you should tell us what your algorithms are. We, the government, should be able to regulate those, but not directly the things that people say. Several, including Jonathan Haidt, a psychologist who may be familiar to many of you, he's gotten a lot of attention in recent years. Several people favor the idea that we should have regulations that limit the amplification of what people post. that, well, the amplification in particular of fringe ideas, and that favor or give more voice to the majority. Another camp, and I won't go on too long about these, there are many variations, but yet another camp says what we need is something like the fairness doctrine. Anybody ever hear of the fairness doctrine before? It used to be the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, had a fairness doctrine, and basically the idea was you're going to have to be exposed to certain information. We don't want people just reading all the stuff that they want to read or going down these holes of just, they're just getting their own predispositions reinforced. So what a few people have proposed is we need a version of the fairness doctrine such that we're going to make you look at this, Kirk. If you're going to look at A, B, and C, you're going to have to look at D before we let you look at anything else. Again, the thought being this would moderate people's reactions and their opinions. Okay, so there's a variety of proposals out there. Again, these are from the people who, who say, look, we're not completely opposed to free speech. We want to try to respect it as much as we can. But beneath the variations, the central thrust of the argument, the digital is different argument, is plain. It's that new technology is a game changer. It alters our capacities and intensifies the stakes. Bad information these days can do more damage more quickly than in the past. That's why speech laws or the treatment of speech by the government that might have been okay in the past isn't enough anymore. The digital era is different. We need to adapt. Okay, so that's the basic case. I always feel like I've made that case a little too well. It's like, really? You're going to get out of this now? I mean, it sounds, there are a lot of differences here, don't you think? Is it a difference that matters? Is the digital different in ways that should alter our legal treatment of speech or of the press? So again, I just want to consider one aspect of this in responding tonight, but I do think it's a crucial one. It's the model of knowledge acquisition that lies beneath the call for regulations. So I'm now on part 3 if you're following the outline. Opponents of the difference argument will frequently point out that this kind of argument has greeted numerous introductions of technology in the past. We heard something like this when television was introduced, and before that when radio, and before that when cameras came in, people freaked out and thought, oh my God, we need some new laws. And before that, the telegraph, or the telephone, or the printing press. Yet, again, opponents of the digital is different argument. Yet, these people will say, look, we survived, which shows that calls for legal reform on the basis of such developments are overblown, unwarranted, right? But I think that response is too glib. It leaves important questions unaddressed, such as, well, is, quote, we survived, is survival the test? Did we at such times, with the introduction of some of these new technologies, enact regulations that maybe helped us survive? And having survived, is the quality of our discourse nonetheless the poorer due to differences that we've not adequately responded to? Most importantly, though, I think is simply this. Look, even if fears of the impact of previous technologies were exaggerated, that doesn't mean we could never have a new technology or new changes that really do transform things in ways that would make it appropriate for the legal system to adjust, right? So I think you've got to be open to that. And even though the thrust of my argument tonight is that I don't think the current digital differences make a difference, I'm not closed in principle to the fact that, yeah, there can be some changes in context that make it make absolute sense, consistent with all the principles of good law, that you have to change some laws, okay? So again, my basic point here is I don't think you can breezily brush aside this digital is different by saying, oh yeah, we've heard that song before. No, you do have to dig deeper. So that's what we're going to now do. Okay. Now, defenders of the difference argument for content regulation might invoke an analogy to bolster their side. They might say, look, suppose that people should be free to own guns. And you're all in Texas, so you should at least be able to imagine that, right? I mean, let's just suppose, for the sake of it, that people should be free to own guns. Even on that premise, though, virtually everyone would agree that owners should not be free to stockpile massive quantities of weapons and ammunition. The reason is simply that such huge accumulations, if only through accident, something such as a fire, right? Such huge accumulations are more likely to do damage. So at certain quantities, we restrict guns. Even if we think, even if we think generally you should be free to have a gun, we restrict them. We do the same with certain chemicals, restricting permissible quantities and imposing storage conditions for poisons and pharmaceuticals. So the difference argument holds that speech is comparable. Even if one believes that individuals should generally enjoy great freedom of speech, today's conditions conspire to make speech more potent, and as a result, it should be restricted. Is this a fair analogy? I think not. Information is different in kind from physical materials. The behavior of guns and chemicals is completely a function of physical conditions, an object's own material composition along with the physical properties of the other things and the environment around it. Under certain conditions, physical materials pose objective dangers to human health and safety. Not so intellectual material. Ideas cannot explode on their own. Ideas can't implant themselves without further action on the part of the consumers. I mean, we have to be careful of these metaphors that we use all the time. Toxic ideas and viral memes. They're only metaphors. An idea cannot do anything without the willing cooperation of people who believe what they read and then choose to act on that basis. But the individual's mind is volitional. He's responsible for what he thinks. Put this a little differently. Journalism is not a spectator sport. It requires audience participation. In order to reap the value that journalism can offer, it's not enough for a consumer to simply sit back and watch in the way that he might take in a tennis match. Nor can he adopt the vending machine mentality that's adequate to obtain certain material goods. I put in my $2, Coca-Cola out, right? That's the value I want. $2, I get my Coca-Cola, right? Yeah, that's fine for certain material values. But journalism's product is intellectual material. And the value of that material is not contained within it, like the Coke is in the can that's now in your hand, right? No, the value of that intellectual material is not contained within it. It's not in the ink on the page or the pixels on the screen. The value of the material hinges on how a given consumer processes it, how actively, how logically he works to understand it and to assess it. Yet the increasingly pervasive attitude today is digital fatalism. The algorithm made me do it. That's what made me think that. But the problem is that's not so. One person's ideas are as impactful as other people allow them to be. The sheer expression of an idea does not accomplish anything. That idea could expire as soon as it's uttered because people ignore it. It's virtually forgotten. Or, by the same token, it could become influential if the readers or the listeners, if they regard it in certain ways. But that's up to us. That's up to the readers, the consumers. We control what we expose ourselves to and what we make of it. As evidence, witness the countless people who consume the same content as others and who don't succumb to falsehoods and fallacies or who recognize the specious reasoning for what it is. Okay, so since I'm saying ideas can't seize possession of people, how do human beings reach knowledge of an issue? To understand where the digital is different argument goes astray, it's instructive to consider more directly its underlying model of knowledge acquisition. Essentially, its contention is, some people know. They simply do. Some of us are oracles, mysteriously empowered sages who can inform the rest of us of the truth concerning vaccine safety, nuclear energy, geopolitical history, genetically modified foods, gender identity, you name it, whatever the contentious issues of the day or whatever the frontiers of knowledge. They're able to do this. Now, this is the part you have to understand, right? They're able to do this not as a result of rational investigation and open discussion of findings and inferences, because if we believe that that were the route to knowledge, we would respect the freedom of opinion that makes that possible. To support coercive content restriction is instead to declare that open exchange of ideas is not needed to attain knowledge. Again, some people just know, so let's just go by them. What's wrong with this picture? Well, first, just consider its implementation, the implementation of this policy. So again, if you're following the outline, this would be under 3. This would now be problem A, implementation. Suppose the government should ban misinformation. What, under those circumstances, should people not be able to say about, for instance, gender identity? If someone claims that there are 2 sexes and only 2 sexes, is that permissible as part of constructive dialogue, or should that be verboten as misinformation, sir? If someone, say now 10 years ago, said there are more possibilities than those 2, should that have been forbidden as misinformation? How would you get from there to here if we silenced that view? And this isn't an argument about the merits of the different positions on gender identity, right? It's just an argument about how people inform themselves of what's even relevant to consider to figure out gender identity issues, right? What about expression of different views on the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Am I allowed to call it the invasion of Ukraine, right? Or is that misinformation? What about different ideas expressed about the origins of COVID, or the effects of particular life extension therapy, or the likely economic repercussions of a debt forgiveness? What ideas should be silenced to protect us from misinformation? I mean, right away, you've got some serious questions just in terms of trying to implement such a policy. To state the obvious, the government is not expert in the multiple fields in which people seek knowledge. Its business is rights protection, not knowledge expansion. It would be foolish to place the power to prohibit the expression of certain ideas in the hands of amateurs. Again, they're amateurs at that. That's not their business. But the problem with government regulation is far deeper than the government's lack of expertise. Okay, so now this is the problem B. To see this, consider afresh. When people do have knowledge of some subject, how do they know what they know? By what route do they acquire an accurate understanding of phenomena, whatever the phenomena might be? Historically, time and again, the expert consensus on a question evolves. Advocates of what are today fringe views or heresies often light the way to our coming to understand the actual truth on an issue tomorrow. On difficult subjects, knowledge is typically advanced through extended dialogue, as students of that subject disagree and debate and refute one another, or refine or expand or build upon the further implications of somebody else's ideas. To figure out what is true, we often have to grapple with a lot that turns out to be false. To be permitted to speak exclusively to people who are not permitted to think or say differently, that doesn't facilitate the growth of knowledge. At best, it reinforces our errors and omissions. Simple illustration. Suppose you're engaged in a particular research project. Self-driving cars you're studying, or the efficacy of a new diabetes treatment, okay, something like that. You're on this research team working on this, but subject to legal prohibitions on publishing particular hypotheses concerning the causes of the findings that all of your studies are turning up, right? You're legally permitted to discuss numerous other ideas, but not hypothesis X. The reason that you may not discuss X is not, the reason that you do not then discuss X, the reason that you don't in fact discuss X, is not that you've been convinced that X is mistaken, nor that the field's finest experts have been convinced that X is mistaken. Rather, you're quiet about hypothesis X because government officials don't want people to consider X. That's not the path to knowledge. in principle, in pattern. That's not the way to get it, obeying orders from the higher ups. That's not the path. Ultimately, knowledge stems from empirical encounters with relevant phenomena. It depends on direct observation of reality and on layers and layers of logical inference from the observed to the unobserved. That's what enables us to fly a plane or to do a kidney transplant. When laws close off lanes of that possible contact with the realities around us, people's observations are blinkered, and reasoning that's based on those observations is half blind. When you can only engage with redacted reality, you can only arrive at partial understandings and potentially quite misleading conclusions. Now, there's a lot more one could say about this. There's a lot more one could say about this. And this is obviously just a very quick foray into contested territory about the foundations of knowledge. But I hope, that for our purposes, it's sufficiently basic to support the larger point, which is that government supervision of intellectual exchange is inimical to the search for knowledge. It can only obstruct the quest for better conversations that yield more truth, which was what was animating all of this concern in the first place. Let's see. I mean, none of this is to minimize the fact that in open, more free exchange, people will be confused sometimes by other people's ideas. But to have the government decide what we can consider would hardly improve things. It would make us more vulnerable. When speech is free from coercion, then alternatives can abound. And if I suspect I might be getting poor information from one source, I can try some others. When the government restricts the market of permissible sources, though, of what can be said, silencing those who would say X or those who would suggest Y, then you have fewer alternatives, fewer channels that could be sources of good information and astute analysis. You're more dependent on what the government thinks. So the rational response to the fact that some people's opinions are bogus is not to turn around and surrender our minds to a different set of people, the government censors. They're as fallible as anybody else. Knowledge is not a matter of say-so. Its validation doesn't rest in the identity of the people affirming a given idea. Yet the legal policy will decide, the government will take care of it, treats it as if it is. It presupposes, again, that some people just know, and the rest of us should take their word for it. Why should we take their word for it? Basically, again, if it's not proven through open discussion, then basically because, well, they've got the guns. We're to accept the truth not because they've offered better proof for it or stronger reasoning, but they have the muscle to make people comply. Might makes truth. And let me close this portion of the talk. There is still more, but this portion of the response to the difference, digital is different argument, with an instructive note from history, which I only learned a few years ago. You know, we use this term, freedom of the press. Anybody know anything about the history of that term, like when we started using that term? When the printing press came in. It's one of those you feel like, oh, I should have thought of that. I don't know, I felt like that when I learned this a few years ago. But here's the idea. Here's what I learned just a few years ago. That the distinct concept and term freedom of the press, as opposed to freedom of speech, emerged in tandem with the birth of the printing press, because the term was intended to convey that this then novel technology of the printing press that people might employ in exchanging ideas did not alter individuals' rights. The principle of free speech abides, whatever the particular means employed to engage in speech. In other words, okay, you're going to use the printing press now? Fine. That doesn't change the principle of your right to say and his right to read what you guys want to, what you agree to. So likewise today, while digitization may change the ways that people communicate, it doesn't erase individual agency, our responsibility to think through whatever we're hearing. It doesn't erase rights, and it doesn't extend the government's mission. As long as a person's speech does not infringe on others' freedom, the government should leave it alone. All right, so I do want to say, much more briefly, a little bit about this parallel between press freedom and religious freedom. I think it might be helpful. So I give you on the handout a passage which some of you may have heard before from Thomas Jefferson. He observed that the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Okay, he was talking about religion, right? Whether my neighbor says 20 gods. What about other types of beliefs? Does it change things when the subject is not my neighbor's beliefs about divinity or salvation, but about the environment or medicine or any of the other sorts of issues we might imagine? Would the expression of my neighbor's beliefs in that case pick my pocket? No. Hearing your neighbor's opinions can influence a person, to be sure, if he is persuaded by that person's ideas. Or he might be influenced by being dissuaded from the ideas. You're such a bad spokesman for those ideas. Wow, now I'm convinced that that view really is wrong, or whatever, right? So, yeah, you can be influenced by your neighbor's opinions, but it's a big if, right? The if you're persuaded. Again, words do not necessarily bring any particular effects. Whether they do depends on the listener. The pickpocket, by contrast, he offers his victim no choice, right? He unilaterally deprives them of their property, stealthily helping himself without any audience cooperation on their part. The speaker simply puts forth ideas for others to judge as they will, just as you can do, and you should do tonight, judge as you will. So I'd suggest that we conceive of press freedom in the same way that we think of religious freedom. The First Amendment, which again I handily give you on the handout, but if it's free speech week, you ought to refresh on the First Amendment. But I put it there particularly because, or to corroborate simply what I'm saying now, which is, look, when it comes to religion, the First Amendment addresses two aspects of religious freedom: committing the government neither to establish any religion nor to interfere with the free exercise of religion. The same secularism should also reign over the separation of journalism and state. The government should respect the free exercise of journalistic activity, of news gathering, investigating, reporting, editorializing, by imposing no special burdens or barriers, no taxes, no licensing requirements, or the like. And the government should refrain from any form of establishment by granting no favoritism toward journalists, no subsidies, no legal shields, or the like. It should erect no ministry of truth by favoring mainstream ideas or moderate opinion or good information, just as it should erect no state church. For, as Justice Robert Jackson put it simply, and I give you this passage on the handout at the bottom, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox. I won't read you the whole rest of the quote, but yeah, that's the basic idea. Our Constitution is committed to intellectual freedom. So a few thoughts in conclusion. The original impetus behind the call for regulations is the concern too many people are falling for bad ideas. We need to clean up the waters where our conversations are taking place, to remove the noxious ideas so that truths can defeat falsehood. My contention has been government regulation does not accomplish that. When the legal system says shut up to some views by prohibiting their expression, scrubbing material from the internet, disabling access to certain platforms, screening material to prevent certain views from being aired, it doesn't demonstrate what's mistaken in the views that it contends are mistaken. It doesn't change the underlying facts that are in question on a given issue. And it doesn't allow those people interested in the issue the full range of opinion and argument available, or that should be available. It simply hampers people's ability to determine whether or not a given claim is true, or false, or partially true. Intellectual freedom is the necessary scaffolding for the acquisition of knowledge. Thus, its deprivation, the deprivation of that freedom, is self-defeating because it's knowledge-defeating. Misinformation is dangerous. And here again, you could go on with graphic horror about the effects of the belief in misinformation, right? When people storm the Capitol based on bogus beliefs about election fraud, people's skulls are bashed. People go to the hospital, people die, and the very rule of law is throttled. When people espouse myths about vaccines, unvaccinated children die of measles. They die of measles. But my point here is, knowledge is vital to human well-being. Ignorance at its mildest holds us back. At its worst, it destroys real values. That's why it's critical that we understand how we build knowledge and respect those conditions that make it possible. So I should be more precise. A minute ago I said, misinformation is dangerous. It's dangerous if it's believed. When we lament the spread of corrosive ideas, the problem is not so much, or let's put it this way, the problem is in what some people believe rather than in what other people say. Again, I'm not talking about the fraud cases, those sorts of cases, right? If some people spout specious ideas, but few are persuaded, no problem. The problem arises when people accept foolish ideas. But that's a thinking problem. Again, bringing me back to the cognitive here, right? That's a thinking problem, and it's the responsibility of the individual. It's a cognitive responsibility, and it can't be solved by coercive measures. No laws can work around this. Legal prohibitions do not change minds. Fining you is not going to make you have a different conclusion about gender identity. Putting me behind bars is not going to make me a more discerning thinker. Calls for the government, for the law to restrict our conversations, don't let him say that, are essentially calls for cognitive paternalism. Take care of us, government, just tell us what to think. That kind of greater dependence on the government, that's not going to make us stronger thinkers. That's not going to enhance our ability to actually come up with truth on different issues. So let me actually say something again in more colloquial terms. Something I said just a few minutes ago. Is a more rough way of putting it. When a person espouses views that you regard as wildly wrong, the mute button is not an answer to his view. Cutting off Galileo's mic doesn't alter the motions of the planets. It just delays anybody's figuring out what the motions of the planets are. Truth doesn't emerge from silencing people who think the people who think differently. So my contention basically is that the problem posed by today's information ecosystem is not an excess of freedom, it's our neglect of cognition. We won't enjoy a healthier information environment unless we confront, do we really want it? Do we really value that? How much do we value it? And if we do, exert ourselves to try to achieve it. Not by pressuring the government to groom our opinion, to restrict us to its views, but by pressing ourselves to be more rigorous thinkers. We'll make mistakes, right? We will make mistakes, however conscientious our efforts. But it's only through free and open exchange that anybody can ever come to discover his mistakes and find a truer path. Okay, I'll leave it at that so we do have some time for questions. Thank you. A good job.
People should come up to the mic over here for a question. Like, I'll turn this camera already.
Thank you.
Hi.
Could you address the area of speech that directly calls for violence against other people? In the way I understand it, prohibiting that is not putting limit on free speech, but it's part of the government role of protecting individuals against injury.
Yeah.
But it's, for some, it seems that might be gray.
Yeah. Does everybody understand the question? Basically about speech that does seem to, incite violence would be one form of what you're talking about, right? Yeah. Well, okay. So I haven't thought a lot about what the exact boundaries should be, but it does seem to me that there are forms of speech in which you are directly calling for others to either join you or, instead of you, do things that would violate others' rights. Now, you should not be accessory to a crime. You should not be encouraging the commission of a proper crime, okay? Now, where the questions arise or where it gets a little fuzzier is, well, exactly where the boundaries should be drawn if I am theoretically proposing, that we overthrow the government or something, but as a theoretical proposition, not here, telling you here, now we're going to plan this raid on this date and so on. Maybe we should use an example like planning the raid, here are the weapons, this is when these people are going to be at home, or this is when we think we can gain access, and talking with you in ways that are planning a crime or, again, encouraging others to commit a crime. I do think, that's part of an attempt to violate rights. You have no right to do that, right? Exactly the part that I haven't thought carefully about is what is the line between that is part of an attempt to violate their rights, and I'm just, writing a philosophical treatise, which the implementation of which ultimately might be a bad thing, or, worse than a bad thing, a violation of rights. But there's got to be freedom of exchange. There's got to be freedom for different ideas about the best ways of having a society or doing things, what those best ways are. But that is different from, look, this guy's an abortion doctor. I know he gets home from work at 6 o'clock. Here's his address. I'm going to help you or, encourage you to go attack his property, his family, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Smith. Very enlightening speech. So my question or comment kind of has to do with the reason or the prompt, like why this issue of censorship is so important. And it seems to me, and I just want to kind of get your opinion on this, and it goes along with your thesis that fundamentally nothing has changed. The technology hasn't really changed the situation. And the reason, in that healthy societies don't need to censor. So I think it was Nietzsche who said that like the ultimate society that had the ultimate amount of strength would not even bother like arresting criminals or dissidents because, or punishing them in any way because it was just so secure in itself. And as our society, our republic becomes less secure in itself and is in decline, the need for censorship and hard power is increasing. And I would say that what motivates censorship, therefore, is not the truth or falseness, making an adverb out of that. Anyway, sorry. It's not the truth or false of a certain claim, but it's how dangerous it is to the government and other centers of power. And if that's the case, then any sort of algorithmic censorship technique that doesn't censor on the basis of values will ultimately be unsatisfactory to those who wish to censor. So is this a thesis that you would endorse, that maybe this is just part of a historical trend of the same thing that happened to Rome or that Greece, that republics tend to degrade in a certain way after a period of time, and that this is a natural outcome? Or is there something about the technology that is making this, is there another reason why we seem to be having this debate? And not only why we're having this debate, but why the pro-censorship people seem to be winning, where every time we've had this debate in the past, it usually ends up with the more free speech side of things tends to win the day, except for some exceptions like war and such.
Really interesting, but I feel like there are about 5 different issues in there, at least. But all very interesting, but let me try to unpack them a little bit and say what I can on some of them. So, yeah, it's not that I don't think, just one of your general characterizations at the beginning was, but, the situation really isn't different, I seem to be saying. The situation is different. I mean, our communications are very different than they were 40 years ago. I mean, believe, as a person who was an adult 40 years ago, I can tell you, communications are very different, and it does make a difference to the way the way most of us consume lots of information now is different than it was a while ago. So there are real differences. What I'm been challenging is the idea that those differences make a difference to how the law should proceed in terms of censorship or what's free or not. I don't have a big historical thesis on, is this just the Roman Republic again, or why? So I don't think there's something inevitable at all about the situation we're in. I take seriously myself when I said, I do think, there's a real cognitive problem here. What I mean is people aren't thinking all that carefully. Sometimes they don't want to. Sometimes they're not motivated to. Sometimes they want to believe, sometimes we, or on particular issues, many of us may fall into this. I believe what I want to believe on that. So yeah, I want to read these sources. I want to hear this stuff that reinforces my opinion. I mean, we can all fall prey to this to different extents, but that responsibility is on us. And slapping laws on isn't going to change somebody's mind, and it's not going to help any of us if we really care about, we want people to believe the true things about COVID or about the election or about whatever the issue might be. Well, if we want them to believe the true things, and the way to find out the true things on any issue, and history has shown this, is by letting people disagree and say, you're a jerk, and then, 300 years later, there's the statue to him because he wasn't the jerk I was, right? He got it right. You need to keep open the lanes through which we can find the truth. So that's to address some of your questions. I feel like I did leave out one or two, though. Did you want to follow up? Sure.
So, I mean, particularly when you mentioned that many of the things that are censored, some of them are true and some of them are false. I mean, and that's obviously our own judgment. We can't, we're not oracles. But I think it's interesting to think about what is censored and what's not, and why is that, and what is the pattern there. And so that's where I feel that, I don't know, maybe more investigation is needed.
Well, yeah, two things. That also reminds me, I want to come back to the Nietzsche thing. Censors can censor for all sorts of different reasons. I mean, a censor, literally, is, and historically were, government officials who would screen material and, this can't be published, this can't be published, right? Or they would read through letters of different, okay. There are all sorts of reasons why people, including government officials or governments, might have their policy to censor this or to censor that. There could be self-serving reasons. There could be the best motivated reasons, right? There could be the most truth-seeking reasons. But that doesn't change the nature of what they're doing. I mean, good reasons or bad, that doesn't determine whether or not the policy is knowledge conducive, is most fruitful for, if you really want the truth on this, you want to leave free opinion on this, right? The other thing that I was just reminded is, one of your comments was about Nietzsche and a view that, well, if you're really strong and sort of self-confident as a society, you don't need laws. Oh, no, I think we need laws. I think we always need laws, and that's like quite apart from free speech issues in particular. I do think we need laws to try to protect individuals' rights. There are all sorts of things to say about how inclined people would be to try to infringe on others' rights, the more healthy a society they are overall. But other questions? Sure.
I'd like to know if you could address a problem that a lot of Americans don't know about, and that's the fact that many of these big tech companies are also doing the bidding of other corrupt governments around the world, such as the European Union or, somebody like the most evil woman in the world, and that's, of course, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and they are acting as censors on behalf of these other governments, and their EU is saying censor these Americans for publishing this, and they're violating the rights of Americans on behalf of the EU. Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, how do we deal with this problem with...
Well, first of all, you bring attention to it, right? To the extent that and a lot of attention has been brought to various practices of tech companies and others in recent years. That is, I mean, we keep reading these exposés that expose facts that have been around for like 15 or 20 years in terms of, oh yeah, don't you know that, Google gives you a different set of feeds than it gives this guy and that guy and so on. Or, oh, they're just doing this for the money, as if trying to make money was new and journalists in the past didn't have to make money and so on. So all I'm saying there is we can, when we have freedom of speech and freedom of the press, we can investigate and find out who is the money behind, I mean, it often takes time and so on, right? But then you're in principle open and leaving open the ability to find out what's going on, what's really motivating the policies of this company or that company, who's paying the bills and so on, and call attention to it. But you may be frustrated when you call attention to what you think is a big problem, that most other people don't think it's nearly the big problem that you do. But when you're frustrated in that way, the solution isn't, so let's get the government to make a law so that they can't say that anymore or do that anymore. Now, obviously, there's a difference. There are situations in which it's not just a matter of encouraging certain kinds of speech, but actually manipulating the mechanics of an actual election. Something like that would be different.
Thank you, Professor. That was an enlightening speech on a hot button topic. As a consumer of this general controversy, a layperson, if you will, I always see this as being something that is positioned as a truth versus an opinion kind of a
Truth versus, did you say?
an opinion.
Oh, okay.
One side claims I'm
Yeah.
regulating it because you're lying, and I have a responsibility to force you to tell the truth. The other one says, no, it is my free choice. I get an opinion on this. You, of course, made your position clear. The path to truth lies through the freedom of opinion. Is there any concession you would make for something that the world at large accepts as being the truth, and therefore the governments do have a right to stop you from lying?
Okay. That's a great question. Well, what do I mean by saying it's a great question? Because that's what I'm very interested in, but really haven't thought through, but have started thinking about a little bit. Like I read a book a few months ago on protection of falsehood in particular. Because, so I'll just throw out some very general ideas here. And I mean, these are just ideas on different sides of the issue, which all they demonstrate is that, yeah, I think there's a lot to be thought about here that I haven't thought through. There are certain lies that I know, I could tell you falsehoods about myself that probably none of you would know are false, but I know they're false and I could tell you them. But it seems like there are certain such lies that, well, you ought to be able to tell. If I want to tell you, oh yeah, I don't know, I won some race in high school track or something, it seems kind of harmless. It seems kind of stupid. It seems kind of a revelation of, Tara's got some serious issues here if she goes around telling these lies. But there are certain sorts of things, like, I really like your new haircut, Prisha. Oh, I really like it. Where'd you get that hair? There are various kinds of lies that are very, knowing deceptions and so on, that it seems a person ought to be free to engage in. But there are certain kinds of lies that it's like, whoa. And even if they're about himself, well, I won this medal in the Vietnam War, when you didn't. And that seems to cheapen the value of the medal that some other guys did win. There was actually a Supreme Court case about, I don't think it was a Vietnam medal or whatever. But it was some military, right? Taking on military glory that you don't have, and now he's going to run for office and say that he did this, that, and the other thing, and he's got this PhD from Cambridge and so on. So, just trying to give you some concrete examples of, and that's just talking about oneself, let alone, I know this isn't true, but I'm going to keep saying it because about some external fact in the world, some medical fact, some political fact or something, because I think it's going to get more people to agree with my position on something. Well, now, that's obviously morally objectionable. All I can say for now is it's on that list of ones I want to think more about, because it seems like there are real dangers in, if the government is going to decide what's true, then we seem to be putting them back in the, so now you're going to be the knowledge experts business as well. And that's not their business. At the same time, can the government completely eschew? We have no idea what's true or false. We're just, we're in the rights protection business, like Smith said. That has nothing to do with any judgments about truth and false. That seems wrong too. So you see, like, the array of sort of possibilities here, I see reasons and pushback, which is just to say, yeah, it's a great question, but I'm sorry I don't have a good answer. I'll say, so the book I read, and I don't like this author at all, But if you just want to get a taste of some of the issues here, it's called Liars, and it's by Cass Sunstein, who is a professor at Harvard. And it's a thin little, very readable book, but it would introduce you to some of these kinds of issues of, oh yeah, we gotta, and then I'll make it worse. Then there are deep fakes and these faked videos that now, yeah. So, sorry for just musing about that.
Hello, there we go. I just wanted to ask you, a lot of the sort of current discussion and debate about digital media has to do with policy and regulation that maybe isn't strictly censorship. So I'm wondering, does that open the door to censorship ultimately? So we have things like the question of, can these social media platforms continue to receive immunity from liability?
Yeah.
And then things like, I guess, TikTok is a Chinese-owned company. And so there's been a lot of debate about banning that in the US because it's Chinese-owned. I don't know. Do you have thoughts about?
Well, yeah, a couple of things. It actually reminds me, too, of something that I think the other gentleman said in his question. I do think we need to be very careful about the term censorship, and that what people use the term censorship, I think, much too indiscriminately these days. That is, when anybody or company or institution or college or what have you has a policy to not allow a certain kind of speech, that is called censorship. This is how it's used these days. That is called censorship. No, censorship is government obstruction of speech that should be free. It's the government regulating rightful speech, free speech, free, and it's rightful insofar as it's not infringing on anybody else's rights. It might be offensive, it might be morally reprehensible in certain ways, but if it's not infringing on the rights of others, it's within your individual rightful domain, and the government should leave it alone. When the government doesn't leave it alone, restricts it or punishes you for it, then that is censorship. When a private party, be it a private individual, a small company, a big company, says, I don't want at my company people, I don't want working for me, or I don't want to serve as clients or customers, people who say X, Y, or Z, they're within their rights. Now, that policy itself may be morally objectionable in various ways, right? But they're within their rights in that you don't have the right to do business with that guy on your terms when his freedom of speech encompasses his right not to say certain things or endorse certain views, or to hire others, for instance, who would endorse those views. Okay. There was more to your question, I think, but maybe we should get to some of the other questions behind you.
Thank you, Professor Smith. My question is in relation to schools. We have government schools, and I don't know if this is a crackpot idea, but is it infringing on our First Amendment rights in the fact that we have government schools and they fund universities and tell people this is what you need to teach?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think probably so. That is, intellectual freedom I think we do need to think more about separation of education and state. I was saying church and state, press and state, but the government will say what ideas everybody should be educated in. If we're going to have mandated education, and then once you mandate it, well, what's going to count, even if it's privately given, if it's got to adhere to certain government-issued standards, that does seem to be government interference in our intellectual lives. So yeah, I do think there's a tension there. Yeah.
Hello. So I wanted to go into like the freedom of religion stuff that you sort of talked about. So you said that freedom of speech should be treated as a sort of freedom of religion, right? And then you said that, citing Jefferson, that that doesn't violate a religious person, doesn't harm him or pick his pockets or whatever. I mean, maybe for some people that's true, but like my religion carries certain political connotations. So your state not only performatively denies my religious truth, but also prevents me from exercising my religion fully, which does violate. I would say.
I'm sorry. How am I doing that, or how does one? Do
Oh
that?
yeah, because there's certain there's certain like political connotations to what my religion entails. Some of that include, so by saying, so when you have this like secular state, you're basically denying my sort of ability to do that, which violates my, or doesn't allow me to fully express my religion. So your secularism violates my religious beliefs. So despite what you said, so you're saying that my claim to truth has to be subordinated to yours, which in my view is a sort of like a shadow ministry of justice or shadow ministry of truth.
Okay. Interesting question. It's so yes, that is. I think that when you have a government, the authority of the government is supreme over the particular views, religious or not, of the people within that regime. They should be free to do whatever they want as long as they're not infringing on others' freedom. But if a proper government has laws that are designed to do one thing, protect individuals' rights, and if they're doing their job well, then the only laws and restrictions they're placing on anybody are ones that keep people from infringing on others' rights. So let's go to an example with some religions. I mean, religions have all sorts of different beliefs and all sorts of different practices. If a given religion, okay, I'm just going to make this, beat the hell out of your kids. Well, no, the U.S. government, I mean, that's incompatible with a certain principle of the U.S. government, and I don't think my religious freedom would be or should be honored as a legitimate out from laws against child abuse. You don't need a great imagination to think of other sorts of treatments in different religions of people of different sexes and so on, right? But the basic idea is religious freedom is not a religious people get out of the law free card. It's not an exemption from, look, I mean, the Constitution says this is the highest authority in the land. It's the highest secular authority. A given person might, for reasons of conscience, think, I care more about my church, my religion, than my government, and be willing to go to jail for certain things because he wants to practice his faith faithfully. But it's not a wrong on the government's part to do its best to, by its judgment, protect everybody's freedom, and that's going to corral people of all sorts of different philosophical views, religious views included. So here's the idea. There's no right, according to the U.S. Constitution, to practice your philosophy, religious or not, no matter what, or at the expense of others' rights. And again, proper laws would only be means of upholding those others' rights.
So your tolerance will only extend so far as my sort of beliefs don't infringe on what your beliefs are?
No, it's not a matter of what my beliefs are versus what your beliefs are. But a government is taking us, right, by setting up a government and saying, we're going to put you in jail if you do this. Any government that, that says, we claim the monopoly on the use of force here, they are based on some set of ideas and ideals. And what the position I'm taking is, and that's got to be sovereign. Now, we can argue at different times about, okay, but our government got this wrong, or they've got, this is a bad law that they've got, even if it's a generally good system. And we can find, they made mistakes here, and we need to change that. We can need to change some of those. But that you can't have sort of two competing sovereigns. The conscience of this guy, lovely a man and well-intended and all of that as he may be, and the law of the land. I mean, just an example, you had this case with Scalia, who is known to be a devout Catholic. Very serious part of his life, his identity being a devout Catholic. But he ruled in that case, Smith v. Employment Division, where the people were smoking peyote or something. I don't know if that's even the proper pronunciation, right? But as part of a religious ritual. And he was the one on the court who said, no, the law of the land is the law of the land, and we can't give an exemption because it's religious that these people want to do this. Now, people freaked out at Scalia reasoning in that way. He was writing, I think, for majority. And people hated the court for doing that, and they went around and they passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in response. But my point is, Scalia there, and I'm not a big fan of Scalia's by any stretch, but he got it right there in that sense. He was like, no, you can't have these competing ultimate sovereigns, my conscience, religious or otherwise, and the Constitution. It's like, no, got to change the law, and that's what they then did.
Okay, thank you. I would just, I I would just say that I agree with you that say you can't, have two sovereigns. I just, in my perspective, would be I think the sovereign should be, my religion. But I guess we would disagree on that
Well,
one.
it's also, yeah, no, and it's also a question of what is my sovereign as a human being, right? And my sovereign as a citizen of the United States. I might say, if it came between the two, I mean, a given person, you're perfectly free as a, it might even be moral for you under certain circumstances to say, I care more about my religion or my philosophy and living according to it than I do about the government, the law of Caesar, okay? And then I'll take my lumps from Caesar, yeah.
Well, that's just a dualism I want to overcome, but thank you.
Quick thought on the last question from something from your handout that strikes me. What Jefferson says in talking about freedom of religion is it does me no harm for my neighbor to say there are one God or 20. It doesn't break my leg or pick my pocket, but it doesn't say that it does me no harm if my neighbor thinks God tells him to pick my pocket and he does so. And that it seems to me like what the previous questioner was talking about is his God
That's
telling him
an interesting
to
way
pick
of seeing
people's
it, yeah.
pockets and he shouldn't be arrested for it. But I wanted to ask another question prompted by some of the earlier ones. I wanted to know, the talk was mostly about laws that would push social media companies to censor, to hold off certain views, to keep misinformation off of the internet, and that's what was in the title. But I wondered, since we are in Texas, and there is a Texas law that's held up in the appellate courts and enjoined now, and there's a similar Florida law, basically stipulating something like a fairness doctrine, or you can't ban a political candidate from social media. And I think in the Texas law, also, you can't not operate in Texas to get around that. Do you have any
can't not
thoughts on those laws?
Just the general thought that I think they're bad. I think they're unjustified because I don't think, it's not for the government of any state to say what you can do with your property. And I mean, that's the same whether you have very little property or you have a lot of property. Nobody has to deal with you if they don't want to. You can set your policies as you like. You'll alienate some people for having the policies that you do. You'll attract others for having the policies that you do. People, customers who want to use different social media, they can shop around and try to find companies that they think are socially responsible by one metric or another. But it is not, again, and I think part of this is all encouraged by the confusion in people's minds of what is censorship and what is not. You can have policies, private policies, not governmental, any institution, any person can have certain policies of what he will and won't allow. And you can argue with him to try to talk him out of those policies or tell him why those policies are self-defeating for the aims of his private university even and so on. But what you can't do is say you may not treat people that way if they don't have a right to speak on your platforms. They don't, that I want to speak on Facebook or something, whatever my views might be, gives me no more a right to speak on Facebook than my saying, hey, look, Journal of Philosophy, I want you to publish this article of mine, gives me a right to, you have to publish what I want. So that's just the broad, without going into the details of some of these different proposals. But, yeah.
Hi. First, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. And I was wondering if there should be some regulation when it comes to hate speech that directly leads to hate crimes. Like the terrorist groups that currently have active Facebook groups. Shouldn't they be regulated?
Yeah.
And if it can't be through the government, then what about through the companies? Like by eliminating Section 230 and holding companies accountable for illegal content. And that way the companies are encouraged to sort of regulate themselves and take away illegal content.
Well, really good, interesting, again, set of a few questions, or at least prompts a set of different thoughts. So there is such a thing as abetting a crime or being an accessory to a crime. There are probably a few other legal categories in there too that I just don't know about exactly, right? But so there's a little bit like when you are the guy, let's go after the abortion doctors, and I'm going to tell you where he lives and when he's available and vulnerable and all this kind of thing. So when the terrorist, is really recruiting for specific violent action against, committing crimes, yeah, that I don't think should be protected. We do have to be careful, though, as to, again, what constitutes that. But it would be for the government to, again, the inciting imminent danger or those sorts of categories would be the things to be used by the government, not by private companies. Now, private companies, there are all sorts of reasons why they too might want to, and in a lot of views, including in my views, should not just take all content no matter what. I do think that these companies should exert editorial control over what they allow to be published and not. But that it's not our right to say, look, Zuckerberg, your policy isn't the one I would like or that a majority of us would like, therefore we'll make you adopt this one, okay? I will say, and again, this is going to be frustrating, I'm sure, but on Section 230, I think we've got to go back, like what I would want to do to understand that whole issue a little bit better is go back as to why traditional newspapers are liable in the way that they are. That is, for those of you who understand anything about 230, you can just tune this out if you want. But if you're interested in 230, no, I mean, it's not essential at this point. But I mean, I think it's a very live question. Should media company, social media today they've got this exemption from 230, but it's often thought but you better behave or we're going to take that away. I mean, that's the constant threat today, right? Well, what is it that would be taken away? And was that a gift that was a gift in the first place or something that they're not entitled to? And the basic difference here is that traditional media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they're liable for what is published in their newspapers. Different set of rules applies to internet companies, just to speak crudely, okay? I do think we've got to think through what's the rationale for saying the publishers of the newspaper should be responsible for what they put in the letters to the editor or what they put in when they have guests. I would just want to think that through, and I mean that seriously, like really get why they should be liable and for how much they should be liable in the first place, and then consider more the differences and similarities between them and these platform companies that say, hey, look, it's not our speech, it's the speech of all of our users. But we all know by now, this is not like great news or big secret that you're learning here tonight, that, well, all the social media companies, they have to have their content policies, right? They have to have some means, and even if it's buried in, 3 dozen algorithms, there are some policies that lead them to favor this algorithm over that one, or to say, yes, we will publish your speech and not. So there's there's an issue of judgment that's going to be made by even the private parties, but just as there is for a traditional newspaper publisher, right? I guess the question though is for which of those should you be responsible when part of your business is you let other people speak? I mean, just as people can rent out a hall, forget about print and media, right? You can be, you're just going to be the new meeting hall in Austin. And you're going to rent out your hall to people of all sorts of political persuasions and moral persuasions and hobby persuasions and so on. But what they say in there, hey, that's their business. I'm just renting them the hall. Now, again, there are further questions to think about there. Is it, if I know that people are plotting a crime, should I be responsible and so on, right? But short of those kinds of cases, it would seem like comparable rules should apply at the level of different publishers and not just the social ones.
All right, thanks. I think that should be our last question, just for timing. I wanted to actually just come around into the other camera. I want to thank Dr. Smith for a fantastic talk and advertise a bit. We have a flyer around for people on campus. Won't help the people online who want to know about other events taking place here on Free Speech Week. I want to mention for people online, on campus and otherwise, some of our past Salem Center events for Free Speech Weeks past, which Several of them address questions that came up here. 2 years ago, I think both of us did talks on free speech, the First Amendment, the right and the value of speaking freely. That dealt with social media, university content policies, and a lot of things that came up. Last year, we had a panel on whether the First Amendment is compatible with public education, a question that came up here today that you can find on the Salem Center's YouTube page, and also a talk on whether there's a right to protest by Ankar Gate. And there might be some other content as well up there. So please, people, check that out. I want to also mention a few other things taking place on campus in the future that you guys might be interested in. I'm going to pull up my list so I don't forget them. The Salem Center Objectivism Program is doing a podcast every week on Tuesdays, this week exempted for this talk. We're doing it live and with live audience participation over in the I think it's the Legacy Room or the Alumni Room in the Graduate School of Business. You can find information about that on our other events if you go to our page, salemcenter.org/objectivism, or if you come up and scan that QR code for people here in person, we'll put the link up on the YouTube page. Next week, we're going to follow up on the topic of today's talk, thinking about how to do the active filtering of information. How do you think through things that might be fake news, misinformation, etc.? That will be me and Ben Bayer. The following week, we're going to be talking about how to think philosophically about elections. So that's our podcast, Choose Your Issues, which is now coming out weekly. We're going to have a debate in the beginning of November on the 3rd on whether we should go carbon neutral by 2050 or whether rather world government should enact policies aiming at that. That's with Alex Epstein and John Dodgett. We're also going to have a conversation I think November 30th at the end of the month, co-sponsored with the Civitas Institute, new on campus, between Yaron Brook and Mika Watson, discussing Rand and C.S. Lewis's views of the specter of totalitarianism early in the 20th century, or rather just after, in the mid-20th century. What day is the the last thing I mentioned with Yaron? I believe it's November 30th. Ads will be coming out shortly. And if you follow us online, Salem Center/Objectivism Program, or just get on the Salem Center's general news list, you'll hear about all of these events and more. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you at future events, and thank you especially, Dr. Smith.
Thanks.